All right. Ready to dive deep today?
Absolutely. Always ready.
Today it's the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway.
Yeah, one of America's most prolific serial killers.
You guys know you always ask for more on the big cases, and this is a big one for sure.
At least 71 victims.
And possibly more.
Ugh, it's terrifying.
We'll talk about Ridgway's life, the victims, those horrific crimes, all the details, starting, I guess, with his early years.
Well, you know, when you look at the case, what always gets me is how much his early life, mirrors the classic serial killer profile.
Right, that's always the question, right? Like,
yeah,
nature versus nurture.
Right. Of course, it's never a perfect correlation.
Of course not.
But, maybe if we understand the patterns, it could help us intervene sooner.
So let's talk about that. Childhood. What was it about his upbringing that, really jumps out?
Well, I mean, the childhood was really troubled, full of dysfunction and abuse.
We see that a lot, right?
Yeah, but his mother was reportedly really domineering and even, according to some accounts, engaged in some really inappropriate behavior toward him.
Oh, wow.
So that probably had a huge impact, on him developing, especially his views of women, relationships.
And then there's that incident when he's 13.
Oh, yeah.
Stabbed a young boy.
It's crazy. He lures this 6-year-old into the woods, stabs him multiple times.
Yes.
The boy survived, thankfully, but, it's a sign, like right there, that young, these tendencies are starting to show.
That's scary, like a premonition, almost.
Yeah.
What happens when he becomes an adult? Like, do things get better at all?
Not really.
No.
No, he had all these failed marriages.
Uh-huh.
And his wives consistently described him as having this insatiable sexual appetite, always wanting to have sex in public places, the woods.
Oh, wow.
And that pattern of escalating risky behavior, combined with a history of violence, it's a huge red flag when you look back at how everything unfolded.
Yeah. It sounds like he's leading a double life, right?
Right.
Like outwardly normal, but then, harboring all these dark urges.
Exactly.
So set the scene for us. With the Green River killings themselves, where did they primarily take place? Who were the victims?
A lot of his victims were last seen along that Pacific Highway strip in Seattle.
Oh, right.
Which was, known for prostitution.
Right.
And it was like a hunting ground for him.
Yeah.
He was preying on young women, runaways, people struggling with addiction, living on the fringes of society.
Easy targets.
Easy targets. They were less likely to be reported missing. And even when they were, their disappearances weren't really looked into as rigorously, probably, as others.
So sad, so sad. So when they find the first bodies, it must have been a shock to the whole community.
Oh, yeah. It was
in the Green River.
It was the summer of 1982 when those bodies started turning up.
Wow.
One of the most haunting details, to me, is Marcia Chapman.
Yeah.
Her hand was just seemingly waving in the current like she was reaching out for help.
That image, it just sticks with you. Talk about those early days of the investigation.
Yeah.
What kind of challenges did the Green River Task Force face right off the bat?
Just imagine trying to catch a serial killer without modern DNA technology.
Yep.
So you're relying on these more traditional methods.
Yeah.
Witness interviews, physical evidence, and then this thing called psychological profiling, which was pretty new back then.
What is that, psychological profiling?
They basically try to make a portrait of the offender. They're looking for patterns,
Right.
How they choose their victims, the methods of killing, even how they get rid of the bodies.
Oh, wow.
And that info can help narrow the suspects, give you insight into, motivations, potential triggers, that kind of thing.
So did it help in this case, this profiling?
It did. It suggested the killer probably knew the area where the bodies were being dumped.
Right.
That maybe he had a job that let him use a vehicle.
Interesting. So those insights helped steer the investigation.
They did, but it was still a long, hard process. Can you imagine the pressure on that task force? The media, the public, it was intense. And the case itself, it was just overwhelming. So many victims, and the killings kept happening no matter what they did.
Yeah, it must have felt like they were chasing a ghost. Always one step behind.
Exactly. And there were false leads, dead ends.
I bet.
One of the most memorable involved a guy named Melvin Foster.
Okay.
He was a cab driver, somehow inserted himself into the whole investigation.
Oh, wow.
Claiming he had insights into the killer's mind. He seemed to really want the attention. Almost like he wanted to be seen as the Green River Killer.
It's amazing how people are drawn to that kind of notoriety.
It is. But with Foster, there was never any real evidence connecting him. So he was eventually ruled out as a suspect, but he wasted a lot of time and resources. We've talked about how the Green River Task Force brought in Ted Bundy, another notorious serial killer.
Yeah, that's a really chilling detail in this case.
Desperate times, desperate measures, I guess.
I guess so.
They reached out to Ted Bundy, who was on death row in Florida.
Wow.
They were hoping that Bundy, with his understanding of a killer's mind, could help them catch the Green River Killer.
So what happened? What did Bundy say?
It was actually really creepy, but also accurate.
Mm.
Bundy thought the killer probably knew the victims, at least a little, that he took trophies, that the dumping grounds were probably near the killer's home or work. And, later, when they finally caught Ridgway, a lot of those predictions were spot on.
So one serial killer profiling another. It's fascinating and terrifying. But it didn't lead to Ridgway, right? What finally broke the case open.
It took years, but they caught a break. The crazy thing is, they actually had Ridgway much earlier, but they let him go.
What? How does that happen?
So back in 1983, the victim's pimp actually identified Ridgway's truck as the one she got into.
No way.
They bring him in for questioning, but they don't have enough evidence to hold him.
Oh my gosh.
So he convinces them he's innocent.
Really? And they just let him go?
He even passed a polygraph test.
Wow.
And the killings continued.
I can't imagine the frustration of knowing they had him right there. What was the game changer? What finally turned things around?
DNA technology. In the late 80s, early 90s, DNA technology was taking off.
Right.
So they decided to go back and look at the evidence in the Green River case, hoping they'd find a match. And they had saved a lot of evidence.
Sure, yeah.
Including, semen samples.
Oh, wow.
They sent it to the lab to be compared to their suspect list. And in 2001, bam, a match to Gary Ridgway.
Finally.
The arrest was pretty dramatic.
Yeah.
He was leaving the truck factory where he worked, and the police just swarmed his vehicle.
Like a movie.
Yeah, Sheriff Dave Reichert, who'd been on the case from the start, walked right up to Ridgway's truck and said, "Gotcha, asshole." It was a long time coming.
I bet. So what happened next? Did he go straight to trial?
Well, that's where things get a little complicated. The prosecution offered Ridgway a plea deal. Yeah. Avoid the death penalty in exchange for his help in finding the bodies of his victims.
Yeah, what a decision that must have been for the victims' families.
It was. Some felt like sparing his life was betraying justice, but others just really wanted closure, a chance to finally lay their loved ones to rest.
I can't imagine having to make that choice.
It was tough, but he took the deal. Led investigators to a bunch of sites where he dumped the bodies, gave those families at least some peace, and his confession, chilling.
I bet. Tell me about it.
He described how he targeted prostitutes, lured them into his truck, strangled them, often while his young son waited in the truck.
Oh my God, was there any remorse at all?
Yeah.
Any explanation?
That's the haunting part.
Yeah.
His explanations were always all over the place. He said he hated prostitutes, but he kept using them.
Wow.
Talked about cleansing the streets, but he admitted that he enjoyed killing.
I mean, that's just a bunch of twisted justifications. Like, he can't face the truth about himself.
And then there's the necrophilia.
Oh, God.
He admitted to engaging in it with some of his victims.
That's just awful. How does that, the necrophilia, how does that help us understand him?
It points to this total detachment from his victims. Like, he was violating their bodies, even in death. It shows a complete lack of empathy, this disturbing fixation on control.
So he confesses, they find the bodies. What was the final outcome?
December 2003, sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences.
Wow.
No parole. He also got another 480 years for tampering with evidence.
So basically, he's going to die in prison.
He is.
Paint the picture for us of the courtroom during his sentencing. It must have been incredibly emotional.
Intense is an understatement.
Yeah.
The families of the victims, they finally had their chance to confront him, tell him how he destroyed their lives. They talked about years of not knowing, fearing the worst, clinging to the hope that their loved one was still out there.
Heartbreaking.
Some were just so angry, full of hate.
I bet. You mentioned earlier that some even forgave him.
They did. A few families talked about finding it in their hearts to forgive. Not for him, but for themselves, to let go of the anger.
It's amazing that they could do that after what he did. What about Ridgway? Any remorse from him?
His statements, they were all over the place. Sometimes he seemed to regret it, but then he'd blame the victims, say they put themselves at risk because they were prostitutes. He just couldn't take responsibility. And that just made the family's pain even worse.
Ugh, such a classic manipulator. Can you talk about the impact of his crimes? On the families, the community?
The Green River killings really left a scar on the Pacific Northwest. For years, people lived in fear, especially women.
It must have been like a dark cloud over everyone.
It was. Parents were afraid to let their daughters out, women were wary of strangers, everyone was on edge.
And that fear, I mean, I imagine it lingered long after Ridgway was caught.
It did. Trauma doesn't just vanish. The Green River killings became part of the region's history, a reminder of the evil that can hide in plain sight.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll dig deeper into some of the more, well, disturbing details of this case, including those road trips Ridgway took with investigators. Stay with us.
We'll be right back. You know, it's easy to get caught up in all the legal stuff, the investigation, but we can't forget about the victims.
Absolutely. And those impact statements you mentioned, they must have been so powerful.
Oh, they were. I mean, just raw emotion. Those families waited decades for the chance to face Ridgway, to tell him how he'd ripped their lives apart.
What did they say? I mean, what were some of the things they shared?
Some talked about the years of not knowing, just agonizing, fearing the worst, but always hoping their loved one might still be alive. Others, just raw anger, hatred for the man who stole their daughters, their sisters, their mothers.
You mentioned some even forgave him.
Yeah, a few did. Talked about finding a way to forgive, not for him, but for themselves. Try to let go of that anger and hate.
I can't imagine being that strong. What about Ridgway? Did he show any remorse during the sentencing?
It's hard to say, really. His statements were all over the place.
Really?
Sometimes he seemed to regret it, but then he'd turn around and blame the victims, say they were asking for it because they were prostitutes. He just couldn't own up to what he did.
That's just makes me so angry. Classic psychopath, right? Blaming everyone else. What was the impact, of his crimes on the families, the whole community?
The Green River killings, they really cast a long shadow over the whole Pacific Northwest. For years, years, people lived in fear, especially women.
Yeah, like a constant threat hanging over them.
Exactly. Parents didn't want to let their daughters out alone. Women were afraid of strangers. There was just this constant anxiety.
And that fear, it didn't just disappear when they caught him, right?
Of course not. Trauma takes time to heal. The Green River killings, they became part of the region's history, like a dark stain that you can't erase.
Let's talk about something that's always fascinated me. Those, I don't know what to call them, but those road trips that Ridgway took with investigators to the dumping sites. It's both, intriguing and terrifying at the same time.
It was a condition of the plea deal. He had to lead them to the bodies. Can you imagine driving around with a serial killer, listening to him describe how he picked his victims, where he killed them, how he got rid of the bodies?
It's got to be surreal and unsettling.
Oh, definitely. It was crucial for the families to get closure, but it was also like this window into the mind of a monster.
Yeah.
Ridgway would just point to a spot in the woods by the river and say, I left her there. Just matter of fact, no emotion.
It's like he's reliving it, right?
Yeah, that's what they call signature behavior. Serial killers, they often go back to the crime scenes, the dumping grounds. It's like they have this need to revisit those places, to experience that power again.
That's chilling. I remember reading that he actually talked about feeling relief after killing. How do you even begin to understand that?
It's messed up, right? For Ridgway, killing was like this release, a way to purge something inside him. He actually talked about feeling peaceful, calm after taking a life.
That's just, how can someone find peace in that?
It shows just how broken he was. He was operating outside of any normal human empathy.
So even with his help, they didn't find all the victims, right?
No.
There's still some families out there not knowing.
It's heartbreaking.
It is.
They're still waiting for answers, hoping one day they might find out what happened. It just shows you how deep the impact of these crimes goes. The scars, they never really go away.
We've talked about the Green River killer case in a lot of detail.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the takeaways for law enforcement, for forensic science?
This case, it really changed how we think about serial killer investigations.
How so?
It showed just how important DNA is,
right,
but also how crucial it is to be meticulous with evidence. Collect it, preserve it, because you never know. Even something that seems small could be the key years later.
I read that they collected over 10,000 pieces of evidence in this case.
That's right. It's a massive amount of stuff. But they were dedicated. They didn't give up. And that's why they caught him.
Amazing. Let's talk a little more about Ridgway himself psychologically. You mentioned his tough childhood, the failed marriages, the violence against women. Can we dig into that a little more? What made him a killer?
That's the big question, isn't it? Why do people become monsters? Criminologists have been trying to figure that out forever. I mean, we talked about his childhood, how dysfunctional it was, the abuse, those disturbing behaviors he showed as a kid.
Yeah.
There's a theory, the trauma control model, that says early trauma can lead to this need for control, dominance later in life.
So he was trying to control his victims because he felt out of control in his own life.
Maybe. And the fact that he went after vulnerable women who couldn't fight back, kind of supports that.
It's a scary thought. What about the sexual aspect of his crimes? What role did that play?
A big one. Ridgway, he got off on hurting his victims. He was a sadist. And the necrophilia, we talked about that, it shows how twisted his sexuality was.
It's so disturbing. Did they find any specific triggers, patterns in his behavior?
It seemed like he killed more when things were tough in his personal life.
Really?
Like his first murders, they happened right after his second divorce.
So killing was his way of coping, like a release valve?
Could be. He was trying to find some control when everything felt chaotic.
Oh, it's a messed up way to think, but I guess it makes sense in a way. It's just hard to wrap your head around.
When you're dealing with a serial killer, there's never one simple explanation. It's always a bunch of factors mixed together. Biology, psychology, social stuff, all coming together to create this monster.
We have to take another quick break, but we'll be back to wrap up this deep dive into the world of the Green River Killer. We'll talk about the criticisms of the investigation, the plea deal, and what lessons we can learn from this case. Stay with us.
We'll be right back.
So many lessons, so many things to think about.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's that reminder that evil, it can hide anywhere.
Right.
I mean, Ridgway, he has a job, a family, he was just blended in.
Normal guy.
Normal guy, but underneath it all, a monster.
Yeah, you just never know.
It's chilling.
Appearances can be so deceiving. Makes you think, what's lurking inside people's hearts, you know?
Makes you wonder. It makes you realize we have to be vigilant, trust our gut, speak up if something feels wrong.
Absolutely. We can't just assume everything's fine. Got to be aware, look out for each other, and if something's off, say something.
And it makes you think about the victims. A lot of them, they were marginalized, struggling with addiction, homelessness. They were easy targets.
Yeah, it's a sad reality. We have to do more to protect the vulnerable in our society.
We do. More resources, more support, and just a culture that values every life. I think about the families, too.
Oh, yeah.
The strength they showed. Years of pain, uncertainty, but they never gave up. They kept fighting for justice, for answers, for their loved ones to be remembered.
Incredible people. They organized vigils, raised awareness, pushed law enforcement to keep searching. They turned their pain into something powerful, advocating for other families, for more attention to these kinds of crimes.
Real heroes. You mentioned earlier about DNA, how important it was in this case. And I know there have been even newer developments using forensic genealogy to identify some of the remaining victims. Can you explain how that works?
It's pretty amazing. They take DNA samples from the unidentified remains and compare them to those big genealogy databases, like the ones people use for Ancestry.
Right.
And if they find a match, even a distant relative, they can start building family trees and eventually identify the victim.
So even years later, there's still hope.
There is. It's giving a voice back to the victims, reuniting families, bringing closure. It's really incredible.
It's amazing what science can do. And it shows that the search for truth, for justice, it never really ends.
So true. The Green River Killer case, it proves that. Even after they put Ridgway away, investigators kept working, trying to identify every victim, bring peace to those families.
Well, this has been heavy, but so important. It's a story that it makes you think about the worst of humanity, but also the best. The resilience, the fight for justice.
Yeah, it's a tough one, but it's a story we need to tell. It's about loss, grief, unimaginable horror, but it's also about courage and never giving up. We can't forget that.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been really eye-opening.
It's been my pleasure. Always happy to talk about these cases, even the tough ones.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new, maybe gained a new perspective. It's a complex case, a tragic story, but it's a story that deserves to be told.
And as we always say, stay curious, keep learning, and be kind to each other.
Until next time.